panel. All right, so today is the LERA Best Papers Session 7 on discrimination. What I'm going to do is going to keep us at 20 minutes per individual. So what that means is people will present some portion of their paper. We've talked about people aiming to be somewhere maybe around 12 minutes, maybe more or less, depending upon how much time they'd like for questions. But I will cut people off at the 20-minute mark. So I won't cut people off. If you want to talk the entire 20 minutes, then that's your prerogative. But I will cut people off at 20 minutes. Whatever time you have before the 20 minutes is expired, we'll use to solicit feedback, comments, questions. So we'll go in the order, though, that we're listed for the panel in. So let's go ahead and get started with Andrew Weaver, talking about discrimination against women in hiring. And again, just a reminder, I won't cut anyone off, but we'll just give approximately 20 minutes for each person to present their paper and receive feedback. And also, Michael's noting in the chat to make sure everybody needs to introduce themselves, including me, I suppose. I'm Brad Areheart. I'm a professor of law at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, and I'm also a labor arbitrator. So excited to be here today. I also write about employment discrimination, so I'm interested in discrimination as a topic writ large. So Andrew, let me introduce you, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about your post and then into your paper.
Okay, and let's see, can you see that? Very good. So I'm Andrew Weaver from the University of Illinois, a labor economist, and today I'm going to talk about, present some research on gender discrimination in the Egyptian labor market. So that didn't quite make it into the program, but this is a particular context. This is joint work with Osman and Jamin Speer. So what's the motivation here? Gender discrimination is clearly a critical topic, obviously has very negative effects for female workers. There's also a question of whether it holds back economic growth. There's mixed evidence on that point. And as an intermediate step, one thing we really don't have a lot of evidence on is, do the firms that engage in gender discrimination pay any kind of penalty? Are there any consequences for doing so? And this is where the type of discrimination really matters, and matters for any policy remedies as well. You know, as often is well known, there are a number of different ways to think about discrimination. To the extent discrimination is statistical, it's based on kind of rational expectations of productivity differences between groups. Those productivity differences may come from earlier discrimination in, say, educational institutions, but by the time it arrives at the labor market, there are real productivity differences. On the other hand, taste-based discrimination implies, prejudice or bias, and the policy consequences of these or implications are different. If there's predominantly statistical discrimination, this kind of points towards increasing female human capital and maybe remedying discrimination and access to education. On the other hand, if discrimination is primarily taste-based, this implies focusing on changing employer behavior. And those are kind of two different things. We're going to dig into them. So the context here is Egypt. It's a country with very low female labor force participation and high female unemployment. Discrimination is one of the primary factors that people point to around those outcomes. And there's a widespread belief in Egypt that firms generally prefer to hire men over women. And in field work that my co-authors did on the ground in Egypt, they heard stories from employers and other people trying to explain this phenomenon that were consistent with both statistical and taste-based stories. They heard traditional ideas about gender role that are more kind of taste-based. They also heard some assertions about productivity or reliability differences of workers. So again, we're going to dig into this. In terms of our method, we designed and administered a survey of a little over 1,000 Egyptian establishments in 4 industry sectors: IT, retail, hotels, and restaurants. These surveys were very detailed, collected a ton of data at the establishment level on business characteristics, hiring practices, skill requirements, formality, various outcomes, turnover, productivity, all kinds of stuff. The survey is weighted to match the size distribution of the 2018 Egyptian enterprise census. And that's necessary because in Egypt, there's no one national registry of business locations from which you can draw, or at least that's available to researchers, from which you can draw a random sample. So there's no Dun and Bradstreet type registry or longitudinal business database. So we end up kind of waiting. The surveys were completed. They were administered to various clusters of these different industries in cities around Egypt, including Cairo, Alexandria, Almenia, Assuit. These were in-person interviews with HR hiring managers. Each one took about an hour. We had an Egyptian partner that conducted these. And in order to verify, whether we can trust our measures of which employers discriminate, as well as how stigmatized gender discrimination is in Egypt, we use something called list randomization, which I'll talk more about. So our first goal is, studying the extent of discrimination against women in Egypt. It's not always an easy question to answer. You can do kind of Oaxaca blinder type decompositions, but those are setting bounds. They're not really directly measuring discrimination. The most common method of measuring the prevalence of discrimination is a correspondence study where you mail out kind of resumes. In a developing country context, this is problematic because a lot of small informal employers don't use online job sites, and they don't use resumes, including paper resumes, at all. So, a correspondence study would typically undercount discrimination. It's also the case that a correspondence study would miss the associated outcomes. Correspondence study measures, differences in callback rates or, kind of point of hire differences, but it doesn't gather a bunch of information about establishments and their characteristics and any associated, labor-related outcomes. So our survey is going to let us both reach more employers and measure these correlated outcomes. So verifying the incidence of discrimination, we use this list randomization method. This is a little involved if you haven't seen it, but it's pretty straightforward. I'll kind of walk through. The idea is for half the sample, you ask them directly, do you prefer to hire men over women? And then you also give them a list of 4 totally unrelated statements. My apartment has air conditioning, or I have 3 siblings or more. And you don't ask them whether those statements are true. You just say, of these 4 statements, how many of these statements are true? Then for the rest of the sample, you don't ask them about discrimination. You give them those same 4 statements, but you add in 1 statement about discriminating, that they, I prefer to hire men over women. And then you ask them, of those 5 statements, how many are true? So this is an example. Everybody gets the 4 statements. Half the sample gets that 5th statement. And because it's randomly determined who's in which group, you can interpret the difference in mean between the proportion of, people saying this many statements are true between the 2 groups as a measure of the proportion that agrees with the the discriminatory statement. So it's kind of a way of eliciting discriminatory attitudes without requiring people to admit to something that could be socially stigmatized. The key here is, if the list randomization gives you a much higher estimate of the percentage of discriminators than the direct question, then you can't really do anything with the direct question, because the direct question is a massive undercount of true discrimination. On the other hand, if the list randomization gives you something that's at the same level or lower, then you can trust the direct, direct question, and you can start to look at the characteristics of who discriminates and who doesn't. There are a number of papers that have kind of verified the validity of this method. We can talk more about that. So what happens when we ask the direct question? It turns out 51% of Egyptian employers say that they prefer to hire men over women. It's a large number. When we do the list randomization, we actually get a slightly lower number. We do not get a higher number. And what this tells you is discrimination against women in Egypt among employers, it's not a stigmatized phenomenon. It's something that they openly admit to. And this is what our field work said as well, but we've kind of verified it here statistically, if you will. And note, even though the number's lower, the upper bounds of the confidence intervals are very similar here. And so this means that two things. One, we've kind of given a point estimate for prevalence of discrimination. There's some industry differences, highest in retail, lower in some other industries. But importantly, we can now we can identify based on the direct questions which establishments discriminate, and we can start to look at signs for what are the outcomes and the characteristics of establishments that do this discrimination. This is where we can bring back in this question of what type of discrimination. If discrimination is taste-based, then it should be the case that discriminators suffer some kind of penalty. We see actually signs of lower quality workers, lower productivity. On the other hand, if discrimination is statistical, then we shouldn't see negative associated correlated outcomes. Again, this is cross-sectional data, so we're not nailing down causality, but we are testing which economic stories are consistent with our kind of highly detailed data. So the outcomes we're going to use here: number of weeks it takes a hire to reach an acceptable level of productivity, kind of a worker quality productivity measure. Number of employee terminations, kind of a worker quality match quality measure, and the number of weeks or average weeks it takes to make a hire. This is how difficult it is to find a worker. So empirically, we're going to rest these outcomes on an indicator for discriminatory gender attitudes among Egyptian employers. We're going to control for skill requirements. These are detailed requirements about, math, language, inventory management, customer service skill requirements, all kinds of things. We're going to control for a lot of establishment characteristics, and we're going to have industry fixed effects. These are negative binomial regressions. Our outcomes are all count variables, essentially. It's going to be weighted to match the distribution. We include a number of interactions to kind of saturate the model and test for particular stories. So I'm going to shamelessly, these are the marginal effects from kind of the main effects, and these are the marginal interaction effects. I'm going to shamelessly kind of blow by this and summarize it, but I'm happy to go back to the actual numbers if folks have questions. Turns out, on average, establishments that discriminate against women end up with lower quality workers, net of detailed, controls for skill requirements. So we're not picking up skill requirement differentials. Discriminators' workers take 1.3 weeks on average longer to reach an acceptable level of productivity. It's about 24% longer. These effects are large and significant for single-site and formal employers. They're, something closer to 36% of longer to reach acceptable productivity. And note, those are exactly the employers that a correspondence study would miss. It turns out after controlling for formality and the number of sites in a company, larger establishments where there are just more people at that one site, they discriminate less in terms of incidents, but when they discriminate, they face an even bigger penalty, ultimately up to 62% longer for their workers to reach acceptable levels of productivity. We also, find evidence that single-site and formal discriminators experience significantly greater rates of terminations, another sign of lower quality hires. And it's important to say, turns out there is no penalty. There's no significant differences in terms of time to hire. So any studies that only measure kind of, time to hire, vacancies, what have you, those would not pick up the negative outcomes associated with this discrimination by gender in the labor market. These are really things related to productivity and terminations that show up over time. So conclusion, we document there's widespread and overt discrimination against women in Egypt, and we give a point estimate on that. There do appear to be negative productivity consequences for gender discrimination. This evidence is more consistent with taste-based than statistical discrimination. And from a policy standpoint, this means that policymakers really need to look beyond, just increasing female human capital and address changes in employer behavior or incentivize changes in employer behavior in order to deal with the issue. That's what I got.
Okay, Andrew, thank you for that. We have about 5 or 6 minutes for anybody who has questions or comments. I have one, but I'm going to hold off and let anyone else speak first. Okay, I'll speak first. I'm curious, Andrew, so I'm curious if this type of study has been done in other countries, and if so, if it produced results that are consistent with yours, or if in other places where it's been done, maybe they only looked at like 1 or 2 of those 3 factors that you looked at to try and measure if it's more like taste versus statistical?
So I will say, I think this is a very understudied element, and there really aren't a lot of equivalent studies, and for a couple reasons. One, there just aren't having these large scale, conducting studies like this, and I do similar type studies in America. My studies in America are $250,000, $300,000 studies to get a sample in one industry. Across 3 or 4 industries, you're looking at $1 million. In Egypt, we got it done for a little cheaper than that, but it's still pretty expensive. So there aren't a lot of these detailed employer surveys that gather all these characteristics where you can do this. So that's one. The other thing is, as you know, in economics, there's a real preference for kind of nailing the causality and, doing the correspondence study, which are great. I mean, correspondence studies are amazing, but what they give you is discrimination at the callback level, who gets more callbacks or not, period. Like you get that one number out of that study and then you get nothing else. And so, we give up something in terms of nailing the causality, but I would argue we get such rich data, that we can kind of tease out these more complex stories. Now, maybe somebody else can come along and design nail down the causality now that we've kind of pointed out this taste-based and statistical, differential, but it's not easy to measure this stuff. And in a correspondence study, you have no idea whether it's taste-based or, statistical discrimination.
Right.
I have a similar question, is that when, and believe it or not, you see this with Japanese employers in Hawaii and unfair labor practices where they just readily testify they don't like unions and they fire somebody for trying to start a union. I wonder why you wouldn't, if the person is willing to share that they discriminate, then ask the next question, which would be, well, why do you do that? And then they may say, well, there's attendance control issues, or we found that our customers have dropped 20% or whatever. But that it's interesting that in the design that once somebody's willing to disclose, you didn't take the next step to try to just say, why are you doing it?
So that's not an accident.
I figured it wasn't.
So I do this. I mean, I go to great lengths to bury these questions and make it very unclear what we're about. Like these are hour-long surveys that are asking like 80 questions. I try hard. There's such evidence that when you prime people on a given topic, when you start asking like a bunch of questions about, people start to realize, wait a second, this is these people really want to know about my discriminatory attitudes, and everything changes. So we try to just ask a bunch of just the facts, ma'am, questions, and not have them be able to figure out at all what the heck this survey is about. And we have multiple papers out of this, so we gathered other. So I really stay away from things that start to prime people to reflect on their own discriminatory behavior or something. I don't want that, because it will, the psychology evidence really shows that does change what answers people start to give you.
So I have another follow-up, I guess. So in your conclusion, you say, you have a lean toward maybe it being more taste-based than statistical. Like I imagine that in some ways, you could think of this on a continuum where the results would have suggested that it's entirely taste-based, or the results could theoretically have suggested that it's entirely statistical. I understand we can't prove this with certainty. Where on that continuum do you think this shakes out? If we sort of like think of it on a 1 to 100 scale, like how, for your particular study, where does that sort of plot us? Understanding you can't pinpoint it. But.
Yeah, I think in Egypt, so I think both there, I think in typical labor markets, there is both taste-based and statistical, like both these things are happening at once. In Egypt, since this is a reduced form study, we're essentially showing the taste-based effects dominate the statistical effects. Like if the statistical effects were the bulk of the story, you would get insignificant, you wouldn't get these productivity differentials that we end up seeing. They would get washed out by they might exist, but they would be noise. So I would say you're looking at, something of, you're definitely looking at kind of a majority taste-based phenomenon, minority statistical phenomenon, such that the taste-based is really dominating the numbers.
Okay. All right. Well, we're at 20 minutes, so I'm going to stop there. Andrew, thank you very much. That's a fascinating topic. And thank you for cutting through some of the numbers to tell us what they all suggest, because I'm not sure if everyone would have, I would not have been able to track with all the regressed numbers, I'm sure. So Cheuk is next at the City University of Hong Kong, talking about autistic adults in the workplace. Cheuk, introduce yourself, tell us what time it is there, and then launch into your paper.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Cheuk Ming, and I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Public Policy at the City University of Hong Kong. And it is 12 hours difference, so it is in the evening, 11 p.m. right now. And my research interests include disableism, disability politics, and the reproduction of social inequality. So workfare supports neoliberalism by prioritizing business interests over social rights, as disabled people are pressured to take on precarious employment to satisfy workfare policies. The most contested aspect of the social assistance program is the eligibility criteria. The eligibility criteria for income support are often cited as a neoliberalist tool for cutting social spending and reducing state intervention. And most literature gives paramount importance to the impacts of neoliberalism and readily accepts that cultural attitudes such as individualism and self-serving mentality originated from neoliberalism. And while Stone posits that the poor law, born in 1601, was the first publicly recognized government measure, she proclaims that an eligibility standard differentiating the categories of quote unquote deserving and quote unquote undeserving poor was well in place in 1388. And here are my research questions. My main argument is that blaming neoliberalism for social exclusion of autistic adults allows discrimination to hide behind elite politics because the focus is still on a person's economic worth in the political economy. And while it is true that a good government can allocate more money to the disabled population, it does not tell us anything about how the money would be used. It is questionable whether the money would be used to effectively control and silence the autistic adult, and not to mention that there are disagreements between autistic self-led advocacy and parent-led advocacy service providers and medical professionals, those who adopt different models, social or medical orientations. So granted that money can help improve life quality for some, I would show that there has been a history of government silencing autistic adults, seeing them as their disabilities and not human beings. The solution has to start with reframing the argument, shifting the emphasis from treating disabled people as half human beings, as objects, to highlighting societal stigma and systemic cruelty propagated by the state. Disabled people in Canada were regulated by a quote unquote law and order approach in the 1800s, and the institutionalization of persons who were identified as quote unquote mentally ill and quote unquote intellectually disabled continued to grow in the 1900s, coupled with a societal demand to construct more institutions to supply quote unquote care. Biological determinism and eugenics movement born in the 1920s regained momentum in the 1970s and the 1990s. By the mid-20th century, institutions continued to expand for cost efficiency and social control. However, institutionalization was met with a rising criticism from disability activists. These activists were part of the disability rights movement in the 1960s, which called for a stop to the violation of human rights. And it was only then that disability was recognized as a human rights issue. Starker's argument highlights that societal exclusion of disabled people is more than a matter of social structures, but the heightened societal control by rehabilitation masked as goodwill and cultural desirability to abolish differences, quote, a slow slide toward a society that is less and less pluralist, more and more rigid, end quote. In-depth interviews were conducted with 7 working autistic adults and a former Ontario child advocate. And most have given lectures at Canadian universities, had hands-on participation in provincial policymaking, and were invited into provincial and federal consultation. There are also self-advocates, and 3 had experience serving on the board of autistic advocacy groups and our parents groups. And reflexivity is critical in qualitative research. And while I'm not autistic, I'm a neurodiverse ally. And in Well Ambulaka's words, qualitative research is quote unquote co-construction of reality. My experiences with disability accessibility services, volunteering with autistic adults, and having close disabled friends have empowered me to strengthen rapport with my participants. So findings, the Canadian Survey on Disability Report 2017 was the only national report so far, inclusive of people with cognitive and mental health related disabilities. The keyword search on CGV News for ableism generated the least number of results. And there are 3 main themes derived from the in-depth interviews. The first theme is to be unseen and make differences disappear. Ed recounted her experience working a seasonal job at a bookstore chain. She worked her shift from 5 to 9 in the morning, unpacking boxes for half a year, and were, quote, not to be seen, end quote. Ed also thought for autistic adults to be represented in autism advocacy. She was frustrated that while other minority groups could be, quote unquote, seen participating on the board and committees, autistic adults are not only, quote unquote, tokenized, but often, quote unquote, unseen. Mainline identified by they, them, who were the only participant experienced institutionalization during the welfare state, argue that institutionalization was harmful and dangerous as children were exposed to, quote, a playground of the most fouled people that have access to kids, the absolute opposite of supporting people and giving them agency, end quote. Ed's parents, who were board members of a group home to help institutionalize women to take legal action, relayed that it was a helpless situation for the institutionalized women because, quote, even if you reported rape, you were in an institution, developmentally or mentally disabled, who are gonna believe you? So the second theme is reactive policy and disabled people. Ed, who has been involved in advising a co-op college program for neurodivergent students, argued that underemployment and unemployment of disabled people could not be solved by legislation alone. When asked how policies could help, Ed answered that spreading, quote, good testimonies a lot better than government coming in to mandate, end quote. The litigation option is inaccessible as participants claim that the process is too complicated for most autistic adults. Mainline argue that in policymaking, it is reactionary because, quote, we don't stop and say, how does it affect the disabled amounts it? It is decision made, how can we fix the problems and disabled people, end quote. Participants voiced an agreement that what was promised on paper was not translated to real protection of disabled people as a minority group. The former Ontario child advocate explains that government and service providers see people with disabilities, quote, as the disabilities, not as human beings, end quote. And strikingly, all participants claim that most employers have false beliefs and low expectancies of disabled people's performance. Participants relate their lived experience in how, quote, accommodations are mostly about attitudes, end quote. However, it is easier to blame it on money instead, as the former Ontario child advocate explains that, quote, problem is more fundamental and requires more fundamental change than what the government is willing to do, end quote. Starker's historical overview of disability illustrates that disabled people were excluded from society historically because they do not fit into the societal rhetoric of, quote unquote, a normativized universal. Participants face pressure from both the private and public spheres to abolish differences under the guise of paternalistic policies that institute social segregation and forced sterilization. In Working's autistic adults view, government disability services and disability rights are, quote unquote, good in theory, but the policies do little in dismantling societal stigma. In particular, participants believe that reactive policies could not help incentivize employers to hire disabled people, and that spreading employers' good testimonies of disabled employees are more effective than existing policies. So overall, the findings show that the societal exclusion of disabled people is more than an elite political issue or an issue of a person's economic value, echoed in neoliberal explanations. Framing neoliberalism as a problem is not only reductionist, it is dangerous to ignore how the role of how cultural attitudes have been enforced by systemic discrimination. Indeed, the broader historical overview of disability reinforces that it is equally important to address how societal stigma of each era has continued to influence succeeding generations. And here are my references, and feel free to contact me on this topic. Thank you.
Okay, so we have about 10 minutes. Does anybody have any questions or comments? I have some, but I'll hold off if others have some. Well, I'll kick us off then. Cheuk, I understand you to be saying that maybe there's been too much focus on sort of economic solutions and less focus on maybe the role of stereotypes and stigma. Is that fair before I ask my question?
Well, yes, because there is more discussions on raising, like, for example, rates of social assistance. Right, instead of addressing the discrimination, yes.
Yeah, so I mean, I had a few thoughts. So I write a lot about disability law, and first thought I had is that part of, I think, what's challenging when it comes to disability law is something that disability studies scholars have written about for a while, and law scholars have started to write about, and that's the aesthetics of disability. So the idea that sometimes disability can elicit in people emotions that cause them to discriminate unconsciously, whether that's fear or disgust or things along those lines that I think can compromise the goals of reducing stigma, even if you have certain civil rights protections in place. And I think that is, I don't know if you grapple with any of that in your paper, but I think that's one of the reasons there's been sort of an arguably greater enduring stigma associated with disability than with some other identity categories. Have you thought about sort of the aesthetics piece and the emotions elicited, or do you have any thoughts about that?
My thought is that, for example, my in-depth interview with the former Ontario child advocate, he has over 15 years working in the government, and he just says that like bureaucrats don't see disabled people as people. So I don't think, well, it could be unconscious, but it becomes unconscious because it's hiding behind elite politics of a bunch of elites who don't see disabled people as people, because it's all wrapped in the, it's all about money. Like, how are we gonna increase rates, or are we gonna cultivate a culture of people who are dependent on, welfare system? It is these kind of like myths of shaping. I think it's the myths that shaping, that the unconscious discrimination that you're talking about. But I think it goes back to it's all hidden behind bureaucrats who don't really treat people as people.
Sure. Well, again, I would commend Jasmine Harris has a paper she wrote called The Aesthetics of Disability, which is really a riff on the book title that was written by Michael, a disability studies author from years ago. So I think that's something to think about. The other thing I was thinking about, though, is in terms of maybe the focus on sort of economic policy. I wonder how much they could be taking cues maybe from the American sort of experiment with the ADA. I mean, so we, in the United States, we passed the ADA in 1990. There was a lot of bipartisan support, a lot of fanfare around doing this on the heels of the Rehabilitation Act. And people expected that maybe this would produce some great integration of people with disabilities. But then really the literature has shown that at best, employment rates stayed the same, and at worst, really they dipped. I think the consensus among labor economists is that the employment of people with disabilities actually went down. And of course, there could be some of the aesthetics piece that I'm talking about, which is really hard. But I think also there's the sense that there's a real cost with employing people with disabilities that doesn't exist with maybe some of the other identity categories. And of course, some people will say, oh, that cost is misunderstood. Most accommodations are free or relatively inexpensive. But of course, if they involve restructuring the workplace, that might be costly, although not financially costly. And I think there's also a perception that maybe people with disabilities could need more time off to go to doctor visits, or maybe they won't work for as long, so I think there could be some perceptions around that have driven down employment. But do you have any thoughts about maybe the role that the American sort of disability project for civil rights how that might be sort of influencing what the Canadian government is up to?
Well, I don't know that much about ADA, but I know that ADA it is the disability rights that calls for political independence from paternalistic liberation from paternalistic regulation. So such as like institutionalization, like forced sterilization. But you're talking about there's not enough improvement after ADA. But I'm saying, but if you look at SDI, like, kind of like a social insurance, like ODSP, but the issue is both ODSP and SSDI, they are liberal programs. Liberal programs meaning that, they separate political and morality, like law is like who are legal, and then morality is like separated. So the issue is really people who are, liberal perspective that think that, okay, these, like, if you look at historically, like the poor law separating undeserving and deserving citizens. So it is, as I say that, like, as I mentioned, for my theoretical framework, I use Steiger's historical perspective. So if you look at the historical perspective, you could say that, well, I think it is the myth that people think that there's more cost, the real cost of hiring individuals with disabilities. But what my findings shows that what you can say to what you can find to be really objective data could be determined by how you frame your question. And if you look, sometimes if you look for real cost, then you find real cost. And it is the same framing as SDI and ODSP being a liberal program. You need to shift that from a liberal perspective of seeing people on their worth, on whether they can work, to see a person's worth as a person, even if they're disabled. So that's how I found that the liberal perspective is problematic, because for example, your law, you can say that a person is like companies are illegal. They can hide behind a tax law and do corruption, whatever, and they still won't get into litigation. But it doesn't address the morality issue. So my study also touches on the morality issue that is often separated if you only talk about money or capital or employment rates. So I'm not sure if I make myself clear or it's unclear.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, we're really about out of time, and we need to move on to Patrick's presentation. Patrick, why don't you take us away for your talk? Cheuk, thank you very much. I think your project's very fascinating. Thanks for sharing it with us. Patrick, why don't you take us away?
I will do that. My title's a little long, but basically what I'm going to be pitching here is I think a opportunity for the EEOC to resolve one of the major challenges to the agency, which is both their charge processing and case backlog. And I'm going to start by describing the recent studies that I've done on the EEOC online dispute resolution program. We had a workshop, and I presented 2 papers on this. The bottom line is this 2022 research shows, about over 20 years after our original research analyzing in-person mediation, that the online dispute resolution program at the EEOC is very successful. Our first study in 2000 resulted in the embracing of the EEOC mediation program. We showed its effectiveness, the party satisfaction, and this ODR study does the same. But even more so, it shows that the charging party, the person who feels they were discriminated against, the employer, attorneys involved in the process, and the mediators all prefer online dispute resolution. But for the pandemic, we never would have had this happen the way it did, because EEOC was required to pivot to online dispute resolution. So how does this challenging time in the world's history turn out to be this great opportunity? And the answer is the intervention of technology. Now, the EEOC classifies charges when somebody comes in the door as A, B, or C. And A charges are basically the good charges. They look good on their face. They meet maybe publicity reasons, or maybe certain focused areas of enforcement the EEOC wants to accomplish, to send a message similar to the IRS when they will focus on enforcement in a certain area. Category B, or, well, it could be a good case, but we don't know, we have to investigate. And category C, in theory, is, well, it doesn't look like there's much here. The reality is this classification system has always been a failure. It's a chimera, a fable. It's never worked effectively. And what that means is that the average person, and this is the key to this, the average person, that disabled person we were just talking about, that seeks justice, a person because of color, age, those persons are really denied an opportunity to have their case investigated. Why we talk about resources earlier in your question, Professor, and a lot of it does have to do with money. Congress has never funded the EEOC to allow it to do its job. And so a lot of this is at the foot of Congress, but the reality is that person filing a charge doesn't know that. They believe there's an agency that's going to advance their interests, that there's such a thing as justice, that the government will help them. And unfortunately, the EEOC doesn't have the resources. So what happens is these charges are classified. And what we found, and it's just been great scholarship on this, Kirsten Lundberg did a case study, Harvard case study, the EEOC, when it introduced its mediation program. It follows off of our first report. And she discusses the charge handling procedures and provides a foundation for why they did this, and how mediation has been used to effectively handle charges. Ullman's research, along with Catherine Moss, who's done a few pieces, basically shows that for disabilities, this charge classification is just wholly incompetent. In their case, what they did is they had persons with psychiatric disabilities, and they looked at the classification and the intake. And basically, the EEOC persons doing the intake were not competent enough to recognize and respect psychiatric disability. Michael Z. Green, in proposing a new paradigm for EEOC enforcement, used the research from our first study, but talked about the other existing research and the ABC classifications, and said, look, what we know now is EEOC mediation works. We need a congressional amendment to move to more private mediation. This is where cases get moved. It was a great call, a clarion call, and I'm renewing it because while Michael's call was not heard and nobody took action on it, we now have the intervention of technology. So this is a very propitious time, I would say, to EEOC policymakers. The time is now. You can reduce your backlog. Mary Beth Nielsen did a study and showed basically that the ABC classification model didn't work. That was just additional information. And her study was a ABA Bar Foundation study that looked at this classification. Panja and Siegelman talked about this classification system as a failure in a broader discussion, a theoretical discussion of how do you develop claim systems, claim analysis systems, be insurance claims, et cetera, a more almost economic analysis of how do you have an effective system. But here's what Nielsen found. Basically, Nielsen said that they looked at the cases, they analyzed them, they looked at the subsequent litigation, they looked at totality, all the information the EEOC had at intake, but also additional information. And they found that there was literally no way you could figure out when somebody walked in the door and filed the case, whether that case was going to be a good case later or not. And it's a study well worth reading because they're legal realists and they engage in legal empiricism. So you have a credibly robust data that just shows that this classification scheme doesn't make sense. So hopefully I've said enough about the classification scheme. The EEOC knows this because in 2012, they had their Office of Inspector General look at this. And by the way, the Office of Inspector General missed some of the key research I just mentioned, but they did cite all of the research of my team on the mediation program. So they're aware of the mediation program work, but they wanted kind of to ignore the classification issues. So they looked at the charge classification, and they came up with the incredible finding that the EEOC should document criteria for determining C charges, right? Because these are the ones that get dumped right away. That's the extent of analysis, even though we have all this robust scholarship that the entire classification scheme doesn't work, right? They did also note in this report that charge intake is more art than science, regional office inconsistency, and they talked about frontal conduct. In a nutshell, frontal conduct is ways to discourage persons up front from filing their charge. Now, I did that as an agent for the National Labor Relations Board, and sometimes there's jurisdictional reasons you may want to do that, but you don't do it to reduce your charge load because you have such a backlog that Congress is constantly asking you, what are you doing? And you'll see there's always congressional testimony where the EEOC chair is brought to the Hill and asked, why do you have this backlog? So in 2016, it was 73,000 unresolved cases. Most interestingly, there's testimony by former Chair Dillon, where suddenly the cases are disappearing. They're being reduced. The backlog goes down a high percent. New filings are less. They're classified as C cases and dumped right away. And she's asked by Congress to explain how it can be that the charge backlogs dropped so much. You have so many more poor cases being filed that you're dumping right away. And the answer that she gave was quite interesting in this testimony. And you can see her actual testimony if you go to the YouTube clip, because it really didn't make sense. And again, you can see here, I've kind of showed all of the C cases and in the red, how they've jumped in classification. Well, what's changed? Just more people coming to the EEOC with bad cases from the start? Well, that's not what other persons have said, but because the conundrum is the inquiries increased. So more people were interested in the EEOC and thinking about filing a charge. This is when the Me Too movement was in full steam. Disability discrimination we discussed was rising. The Washington Lawyers Committee went to Congress and said, look, the EEOC is just taking charges and then classifying the C cases and dumping them to reduce their backlog and case handling. The EEOC employees claim this. Their union said we're being pressured to classify more cases as C cases and move inventory. So what Chair Dillon testified in this testimony I mentioned earlier was the explanation was they're now sending the charging parties to the correct federal agency. So you would have to believe that all the time in the past, they didn't know how to send charging parties to the correct agency when the EEOC didn't have jurisdiction. She said this. Then she also said that they explained the charge filing process to the employees and that their employers would know they filed a charge. And that was another reason that was attributed to the reduced charge processing, right? These were the explanations. And of course, not only does it not make sense, but the OIG report in 2012 talked about getting frontal, which is this idea of really rigidly grilling the charge up front. So that wasn't new. So an explanation 7 years later or whatever really doesn't jive. So that raises the inference that people's cases are either not being taken or they're being taken and dumped right away and inventory is being reduced. And the EEOC is actually reducing, it had a lower amount of investigators at this time. So you can see the data here where the inventory is dropping. And the conundrum with the charge is that there's less investigators, but the charge backlog has dropped 19.5%. And Chair Dillon was asked about that, and she said, well, you know, we have less investigators, but they're working harder, right? So that's why I guess all of a sudden the EEOC employees decided to work hard as opposed to the past. So again, that doesn't really make a lot of sense. There's nothing concrete here. just kind of circular explanations. So again, this study, our study of the EEOC came out. This is the good news about the EEOC, right? So we're at this really interesting time in history because the EEOC is a tale of two cities, a tale of a chimera where your charge is just going to be probably not investigated unless you get lucky and you're one of the few A charges. You're going to get a right to sue letter that tells you to go get a lawyer within 90 days when your case is dismissed. So you don't get the investigation. But here with mediation, you get to tell your story. There's a neutral person and you have an employer, and employers say they want to participate in this at a much higher rate than in-person mediation because it's more efficient. So we're just seeing this great economic efficiency. So I say the time is now to consider Michael Z. Green's 2001 call for enhanced use of EEOC mediation. ABC classification doesn't work. And when you go up before Congress and you can't explain your charge handling process, and you have a record of academics from various disciplines, law and other areas, all saying that the classification system doesn't make sense, when you've got this continuing backlog, and when you know Congress is probably not going to give you that much more money, you have to do something different for the benefit of the average working person. So I say the time is now. Thank you.
Okay, Patrick, thanks very much. Maybe you addressed this in the paper, but do you have any data on how successful required mediation is in general and online mediation is specifically?
We do, but it's not required. This is, the EEOC doesn't require mediation. I think Michael Z. Green, was talking about a required model. And I purposely, in asking the EEOC to consider technology, don't explain or tell them how to do their job. They'll have to figure that out. I'm not so sure mandatory mediation would be the way, but we know more employers want to get involved. My data shows 62% of the employers indicated they were more willing to participate in the online mediation than in person. And it wasn't because of the pandemic, because of the open-ended questions, which really locked that down even more. It's flexibility. It's less cost for the client. So instead of saying to the client, you want to mediate, I'm going to have to bill you a day. We're going to have to drive to downtown DC or downtown Indianapolis, pay for parking. Now this can be resolved much more efficiently. And the charging parties are reporting a high procedural and distributive justice satisfaction. You don't always get what you want. Mediation is facilitated negotiation. So if both parties are saying they got 100% of what they wanted, then something's not right. You got to go back and look at your survey. So what we see is for procedural, being able to tell your story, et cetera, the data shows it's as successful as the 2000 in-person data, which was heralded as a great success for the EEOC. Now, the interesting thing is settlement rates are about the same, right? And that opens up a very interesting question is why, if the procedure is more efficient, you can bring other witnesses in or persons to talk to very quickly. For all these efficiencies, why do you basically have the same settlement rate of about 72%, give or take? And that's where I yield to my economist colleague, Weaver, Professor Weaver, on the Pareto optimal or whatever's going on, but there's something that my discipline needs the help of the economics discipline to figure out why you hit the wall at a certain settlement number.
Okay, well, we have just about a minute, according to my time. Any other thoughts or comments? All right, well, I really enjoyed everyone's papers. Round of applause to you all. I'm gonna stop the recording today. Oh, Abay, did you have something? Oh, you're just clapping. Sorry. I'm going to stop the recording, but thank you everyone who came and presented a paper and for sharing your research with us. Best papers indeed.
Thanks a
Thank
lot
you.
for sharing.
Thank you. It was very